Locked inside a soundproof equipment trailer while the town cheers for its own destruction, Jake Hensley stares at a contract that has just turned his world to ash. His knuckles are split and his chest heaves from the fight in the rafters. But the physical pain is nothing compared to the signature at the bottom of the page. It isn't just his partner's name on the deed to sell the valley to a toxic waste firm. It's the jagged, decades-old handwriting of Jake's own father, consenting to the ruin of their legacy from beyond the grave. Outside, the festival lights blur through the small, reinforced window as Cole Dawson takes the stage to finalize the liquidation. Jake hammers his bloodied fists against the steel door, the sound swallowed by the roar of the crowd. He has the proof of the betrayal in his hands. But the law is no longer on his side, and the only man he ever trusted has framed him as a thief. As the hydraulic locks hiss shut, Jake realizes he isn't just fighting a corporate takeover. He is fighting a ghost who signed away their future 40 years ago. The fluorescent lights in the mill office hummed with a low, persistent frequency that vibrated against Jake Hensley's skull. Numbers bled across the monitor. Jagged red lines that didn't belong, a digital wound in the company's heart. His fingers, scarred from years of hauling timber and stained with machine oil, pressed hard against the desk. He leaned in, squinting at the screen, tracing the flow of capital that seemed to evaporate into thin air. The digital ledger flashed a deficit so massive, it felt like a physical blow to the chest. This wasn't just a mistake or a rounding error. The mill was hemorrhaging through hidden accounts, siphoned off by someone who knew exactly where the blind spots were. Overwhelmed by a surge of white-hot anger and the crushing weight of professional failure, Jake slammed his calloused fist onto the wooden desk. The monitors rattled. The coffee in his mug sloshed over the rim. And the framed photo of his father, standing proud before the sawyer decades ago, shifted askew. The air smelled of stale caffeine and the metallic tang of the radiator. But all Jake could taste was the copper of his own frustration. He couldn't stay still. The numbers were a ghost he couldn't catch from a chair. Jake shoved himself away from the desk and headed toward the server room, the cramped nerve center of the facility. The air here was cooler, vibrating with a whir of cooling fans, but the chaos was just as thick. System failure icons pulsed on every terminal, a persistent glitch that felt more like sabotage than wear and tear. Jake knelt on the cold floor, his knees popping, and began to work. He reached into the guts of the server rack, his large hands surprisingly deft as he manually rerouted tangled power lines, bypassing fried circuits. He kept a tablet balanced on his thigh, cross-referencing digital shipping manifests against the hardware's internal logs. There had to be a link. The missing funds and these hardware malfunctions were two jaws of the same trap. And Jake searched for the mechanical thread that tied them together. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the dust and sawdust that permeated the room as he fought to reclaim control over the machinery that had defined his life. The heavy metal door to the server room creaked open, and Sarah stepped in, her boots scuffing against the concrete. She didn't offer a greeting. Her face, a roadmap of lines carved by decades of North Slope wind, was set in a grim mask. She leaned against a rack of humming processors, her stocky frame casting a shadow over Jake's work. "You're wasting time with the wires, Jake," she barked, her voice rough like gravel under a boot. She described seeing mysterious surveyors, men in crisp windbreakers that didn't belong in the woods, marking ancient Douglas firs on the protected North Slope land. Jake froze, a length of copper wire clutched in his hand. The North Slope was more than just timber. It was ancestral land, legally off-limits to any industrial development by a dozen different covenants. The news sent a jolt of alarm through him that the digital ledger hadn't managed to reach. If they were marking the slope, this wasn't just about a failing mill. It was a land grab, a corporate invasion of the town's very soul. Jake dropped the wire and stood up, his jaw tight. He needed to see it for himself. He left the office, bypasses the main sawyer where the day shift was winding down, and moved toward the mill's perimeter. The evening air was damp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant, rhythmic shriek of the bandsaws. As he neared the industrial kiln, a hulking structure of blackened metal and hissing steam, he caught a flicker of movement. A shadowy figure lurked behind a stack of curing lumber, too still to be a worker, too deliberate to be a local kid. Jake's pulse quickened. The facility was under active surveillance. He didn't shout. He didn't call for help. He simply moved, his boots silent on the sawdust-covered earth, circling around the kiln to intercept the intruder before the stranger could vanish into the dark embrace of the forest. He cornered the man near the kiln's exhaust vents, where the air was thick with the smell of scorched wood. "Hey." Jake's voice was a low growl, but the stranger didn't wait to talk. The man lunged, and the encounter escalated instantly into a brutal physical scuffle. They collided on the mill floor, a chaotic mess of limbs and heavy breathing. The intruder was agile, wearing tactical gear that felt slick under Jake's grip. But Jake had the weight of the land behind him. They grappled in thick piles of sawdust that muffled their movements, trading heavy blows that landed with dull thuds. Jake took a fist to the jaw, the world spinning for a second. But he gave back a shoulder check that sent the man reeling against a metal support beam. The air was a haze of kicked-up wood particles, stinging Jake's eyes as he fought to restrain a man who moved like a professional. Gritting his teeth against the pain in his side, Jake surged forward, using his superior reach to drive the intruder down. He gained the upper hand, pinning the man to the sawdust-covered floor with the weight of his knees. He reached out, fingers clawing at the dark gaiter covering the man's face, desperate to see who was violating his property. But the intruder wasn't finished. With a sudden, explosive force, the man brought his boots up, kicking Jake square in the chest. The air left Jake's lungs in a pained wheeze as he was tossed backward. By the time he scrambled to his feet, coughing and gasping, the trespasser was already a blur of motion, disappearing into the dense, unlit woods that bordered the mill. Jake started to follow, but his legs felt like lead, and the darkness of the trees was an impenetrable wall. He stood there for a moment, chest heaving, listening to the fading crash of brush in the distance. When he looked down, he saw something glinting in the layer of disturbed sawdust where the struggle had occurred. He knelt, his fingers brushing aside the wood shavings to reveal a high-tech GPS device, ruggedized and expensive. The intruder had dropped it in his haste to escape. Jake picked it up, the weight of the equipment substantial in his palm. This was physical evidence, a piece of the enemy left behind. His mind raced. If he could get into the device's internal storage, he could find out where these people were coming from and, more importantly, what they were looking for on his land. He gripped the device tight, the plastic casing cold against his scarred skin. Back at his workstation, the fluorescent light flickered overhead as Jake began the delicate process of hacking the recovered device. He was more than just a man who cut trees. He had built the mill's digital infrastructure from the ground up, and he knew his way around encryption. He bypassed the initial security prompts, his fingers moving across the keyboard with a frantic, focused energy. He needed to unlock the travel history, to see the breadcrumbs of the trespasser's origin. The travel logs were buried under layers of corporate-grade protection, but Jake's desperation acted as a catalyst. He felt a grim satisfaction as the first layer of encryption cracked, revealing a list of coordinates and points of interest that stretched back weeks. Sarah stood behind him, her arms crossed over her stained denim jacket, her eyes fixed on the screen as the data began to populate a map. The screen displayed a cluster of precise coordinates, all centered in the heart of the North Slope. Jake's heart sank as he saw the dots. They weren't random. They were targeted, located in a culturally significant valley deep within the ancestral land, a place where the oldest trees stood like sentinels. "They're not just surveying," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a rare note of fear. "They're mapping the interior." The realization hit them both at once. The intruders weren't after the timber. They were targeting the very core of the valley, a place that should have been invisible to any corporate interest. Jake's eyes narrowed as he dug deeper into the device's hardware registration. A string of serial numbers led him to a corporate database, and the name that popped up made his blood run cold. Apex Resources. He explained to Sarah, his voice flat and dangerous, that Apex was a predatory entity, a shark in the world of natural resources known for hostile takeovers and stripping towns to the bone. This wasn't a group of vandals or a rival mill. This was an organized corporate threat, a machine designed to consume everything in its path. The financial leak, the server failures, the surveyors. It was all Apex. They were being hunted by a ghost with a bottomless bank account. The final piece of the puzzle remained. Who had let them in? Jake accessed the GPS device's administrative portal, his breath hitching in his throat. He needed a user identity. He began testing a list of known local access codes, common passwords used by mill employees, and even old nicknames. He suspected a local connection, someone who knew the gate codes and the patrol schedules. He didn't want to believe it, but out here, loyalty was often a commodity that could be bought if the price was high enough. He tried one more combination, a string of numbers that was a date they both remembered. The day the mill had hit its first million board-foot record. The screen flickered, and the login cleared. The administrative credentials appeared in bold text. Dawson, C. Jake stared at the name until the letters blurred. Cole Dawson, his partner, his best friend since they were boys climbing the very trees Apex was now marking for destruction. The betrayal was a physical weight, a cold blade twisting in his gut. Cole had been the one he trusted to handle the books, while Jake handled the saws. Now he realized Cole hadn't just been handling the books. He'd been writing the mill's obituary. Every missing cent, every surveyor's flag, every lie. It all led back to the man he'd called brother. The heavy office door swung open, and Cole himself stepped in, looking every bit the modern executive in a tailored jacket that cost more than Jake's truck. He didn't look like a man who had just been caught. He looked like a man in a hurry. Without a word of greeting, he announced a surprise press conference at the Centennial Timber Festival, which was set to begin in just a few hours. He looked Jake in the eye, his expression a mask of practiced professional concern, and gave him a 2-hour ultimatum to secure the digital assets for a new partnership. Jake realized with a sickening clarity that Cole was accelerating the timeline. He was moving to force a premature corporate takeover before Jake could expose him. The clock wasn't just ticking, it was screaming. As soon as Cole left the room, Jake lunged for his terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. He had to lock the accounts, freeze the transfers, and shut Cole out before the damage became irreversible. But as he hit the final command to revoke Cole's access, the screen suddenly went dark. A moment later, a massive red lockout icon filled the monitor. Access denied. Administrative rights revoked. Jake stared at the screen, his reflection pale in the glass. Cole hadn't just been faster, he had been prepared. Jake was the one who had built this system, but Cole had used his own keys to lock him out of it. He was being systematically deplatformed from his own life's work, a ghost in his own machine. Frustration boiled over into a desperate need for physical proof. He turned to his private office door, intending to grab the hard copy ledgers he kept in a floor safe, but the handle wouldn't budge. The door was deadbolted from the inside. A mechanical impossibility unless someone had tampered with the lock while he was in the server room. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy, rusted crowbar from the maintenance rack near the door. With a grunt of exertion, he jammed the metal tooth into the doorframe and heaved. The wood splintered with a sharp, satisfying crack. He kicked the door open, the sound echoing through the quiet office, desperate to retrieve the original documentation that Cole couldn't delete with a keystroke. As he stepped into the ruined office, a sound caught his ear. A muffled, high-pitched whimpering that didn't come from the machinery. It was coming from outside, near the storage area. Jake dropped the crowbar and ran toward the back of the mill. He found his loyal hound, Buster, trapped inside a dark, padlocked tool shed. The dog was huddled in the corner, his tail between his legs, whimpering in a way that broke Jake's heart. He realized with a surge of fury that the intruders, or Cole, were using his dog to distract him, to keep him pinned down while they finalized the theft. Buster wasn't just a pet. He was the last thing Jake had that wasn't tied to a ledger or a saw blade. He smashed the padlock with a nearby mallet and gathered the shaking dog into his arms. As he stroked Buster's fur, his hand caught on something hard beneath the collar. He pulled the leather back and found a small, high-frequency tracking device, its LED blinking a steady, mocking green. Apex wasn't just watching the mill. They were using Buster to monitor Jake's every movement. They knew exactly where he was, how fast he was moving, and who he was talking to. He ripped the tracker off and crushed it under his boot, but the damage was done. They were in his head, in his home, and now they were in his shadow. He didn't have time to process the violation. Two men in black tactical gear, Apex security thugs, stepped out from behind a stack of lumber, their faces cold and indifferent. They moved with a practiced, military precision, flanking Jake on the mill floor. "Mr. Hensley," the larger one said, his voice a flat monotone. "You no longer have legal access to this facility. You need to leave. Now." Jake stood his ground, his hand resting on Buster's head. He looked at the buzzing saws, the smell of pine, the legacy of his father, and he felt a cold, hard resolve settle in his bones. He wasn't leaving. Not today, and not for men who got paid to destroy things they didn't understand. The thugs didn't wait for a second warning. They moved in, and Jake's hand shot out, grabbing a heavy timber hook from a nearby rack. It was a brutal, ancient tool, a long wooden handle tipped with a sharp steel spike and a swinging hook. As the first thug lunged, Jake swung the hook in a wide arc, the steel whistling through the air. He used the tool's reach to keep them at bay, the shadows of the massive saws dancing across the walls as the struggle intensified. He wasn't a fighter by trade, but he knew how to move heavy things, and he knew the terrain of the mill floor better than any mercenary ever could. The smaller thug swung a lead pipe, a whistling blur that aimed for Jake's skull. Jake ducked, the wind of the blow ruffling his hair, and felt the pipe strike the timber hook with a jarring vibration that nearly numbed his arms. He didn't retreat. He used the momentum of the miss to swing the hook low, catching the primary attacker's ankle. With a sharp tug, he tripped the man into a pile of sharp scrap wood. The man went down with a cry of pain, and for a split second, the second thug hesitated. That was all the opening Jake needed. He whistled for Buster and sprinted toward the back of the building, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't head for the woods. He headed down. He knew a hidden sub-basement beneath the main floor, a place where the original foundations of the mill met the damp earth of the peninsula. He slipped through a narrow trap door and descended into the cool, smelling of earth dark. This was where the secure vault was kept. An old, fireproof room that held the original paper ledgers and land deeds, documents that predated the digital age. He fumbled for his flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom to find the heavy iron door. He needed the physical records. If the digital world was a lie, he would find the truth in the ink and parchment that had survived for 100 years. Inside the vault, the air was still and smelled of old paper. Jake pulled a heavy manila folder from the shelf and began to scan the physical restructuring documents Cole had been hiding. His eyes widened as he read the fine print. It wasn't a merger. It wasn't even a sale. It was a total scorched earth liquidation of every asset the mill owned. Cole wasn't trying to save the company. He was trying to erase it, selling off the machinery, the land, and the very buildings to pay off Apex. The town would be left with nothing. No jobs, no history. Just a hollowed-out shell of a community, while Cole walked away with a golden parachute. But there was something even worse buried in the back of the folder. Jake pulled out a hidden geological report, its cover marked with the Apex logo. He felt a wave of nausea as he read the summary. Apex didn't want the North Slope for its timber. They wanted it for its location and its lack of oversight. The plan was to turn the ancestral land into a toxic waste processing site, a dumping ground for industrial byproducts that would poison the water table and kill the forest for generations. Cole had authorized the destruction of the very land that had raised them, all for a percentage of a corporate kickback. The horror of it galvanized him. He couldn't just hide in a basement. The Centennial Timber Festival was starting, and the whole town would be there, listening to Cole's lies. Jake looked at the contract in his hand, the physical proof of the betrayal. He had a plan, a desperate, reckless plan. He would infiltrate the festival's main stage. He would take the microphone, and he would broadcast the hidden Apex contract to the entire community. He would make them see what Cole was doing before the first spade hit the dirt. It was his only chance to save the town from itself, and he knew he might not survive the attempt. The festival grounds were a sea of flannel, laughter, and the smell of fried dough. But for Jake, it was a gauntlet. He maneuvered through the crowds, his hat pulled low, his heart a frantic drumbeat in his ears. He reached the VIP backstage area, but his path was blocked. Heavily armed Apex security guards, far more than a simple timber festival required, formed a tight perimeter around the main stage. They stood like statues, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. Jake realized he couldn't just walk up to the microphone. The stage was a fortress, and Cole was the king behind the walls. He spotted Cole's private trailer parked nearby, a fortified mobile office that looked out of place among the rustic booths. That was where the rest of the documents would be. If Cole had a final signed copy of the toxic waste contract, it would be in the high-security safe inside that trailer. Jake watched as Cole entered the unit, flanked by guards, and then emerged a few minutes later, heading toward the stage for his keynote speech. The trailer was the target. If Jake could get inside, he could get the one document that would make the betrayal undeniable. He needed a distraction. He moved toward a nearby electrical transformer that powered the stage lights and the sound system. He grabbed a metal pry bar from a nearby tool chest and, with a prayer for his own safety, jammed it into the main bus bar. A massive shower of sparks erupted, the blue light blindingly bright, followed by the sharp crack of a circuit breaker failing. The festival lights flickered and died, plunging the backstage area into a temporary, chaotic blackout. In the confusion, as the guards rushed toward the transformer, Jake slipped past the perimeter and ducked into the dark interior of Cole's trailer. The silence inside the trailer was a stark contrast to the shouting outside. Jake pulled a stethoscope from his pocket, a trick his father had taught him for listening to failing bearings in the saws, and pressed it against the dial of the portable safe. His fingers were steady, guided by a lifetime of mechanical intuition. Click, click, thump. The heavy door swung open, and Jake reached inside. He pulled out a thick document, the Apex logo embossed on the front. It was all there, the liquidation clauses, the toxic waste site plans, the signatures. He had it. He had the truth in his hands. He turned to leave, but the door burst open. Cole's lead enforcer, a man built like a mountain with a face like a hatchet, stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the emergency lights outside. "Give it here, Hensley," the man growled. Jake didn't answer. He lunged, shoulder-checking the enforcer and breaking past him into the night. He couldn't go back into the crowd. They'd catch him in seconds. He looked up and saw the steel rafters of the festival stage, a labyrinth of rigging and spotlights. He began to climb, pushing himself upward into the dark heights, clutching the incriminating contract against his chest as the enforcer began the pursuit, his heavy boots clanging against the metal ladder. The air was hot and smelled of dust and ozone up in the rigging. Jake moved along a narrow catwalk, the festival crowd below looking like a carpet of tiny, flickering lights. The enforcer was fast, catching up to him amidst the heavy spotlights. They engaged in a desperate, silent struggle high above the oblivious townspeople. Jake traded punches with a man half his age and twice his size, the catwalk swaying under their combined weight. He felt a fist catch him in the ribs, a white-hot flash of pain. But he held onto the railing with one hand and the contract with the other. One slip, and he would fall 20 feet onto the hard wooden stage below. In the chaos of the fight, Jake managed to land a desperate kick, sending the enforcer stumbling back into a pile of heavy stage cables. But as the man fell, his hand caught Jake's jacket, tearing the pocket. Jake watched in slow-motion horror as the physical contract, the only proof he had, slipped from his grasp. It fluttered through the air, caught in a draft, and landed on a lower lighting platform, just out of reach. He scrambled down the rigging, his fingers scraping against the metal, desperate to recover the document before the enforcer could find his footing. He reached the lower platform and lunged for the paper, but a hand caught his wrist, a grip like a vice. He looked up into the shadows and saw Cole Dawson. Cole wasn't angry. He looked disappointed. "You never could just let things be, Jake," he whispered. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a second, older document. A piece of parchment yellowed with age, bearing the mill's original seal. "You think I'm the only one who sold out? Look at the signature, Jake. Look at the date." Jake took the document, his hands shaking. It was a secret clause, signed 30 years ago by his own father. It granted the landholder the right to repurpose the North Slope for industrial disposal in the event of a permanent financial deficit. His father had built a backdoor into the legacy, a safety net of greed that he'd never told his son about. The revelation crushed Jake more than any punch ever could. Cole's betrayal wasn't just a crime. It was a fulfillment of a legacy Jake had spent his life trying to honor. It was legal. It was airtight. And it was his own blood that had made it possible. Cole signaled, and the security team moved in. Jake didn't fight them this time. He felt hollow, a man who had realized the foundations of his world were built on rot. They overpowered him easily, seizing both the new contract and the ancient deed. Cole leaned in close, his voice cold. "The town needs this money, Jake. They'll thank me for it. And you? You're just a ghost who doesn't know when to leave the graveyard." They dragged him away from the stage, toward the dark equipment zone where the festival's noise was a muffled roar. They threw him into a soundproof industrial equipment trailer, the kind used for sensitive electronics. The interior was pitch black and smelled of rubber and cold metal. Jake hit the floor hard, the air leaving his lungs as the heavy steel door slammed shut. He heard the metallic clack of a padlock being engaged from the outside. He was trapped, silenced, and buried in the dark. He crawled to the wall and began to pound, his fists bruising against the soundproof padding. But he knew it was useless. No one could hear him over the cheers of the townspeople welcoming Cole Dawson to the stage. He slumped against the wall, listening to the muffled vibrations of the festival. Cole's voice began to boom through the speakers, filtered through the trailer's thin vents. He wasn't just giving a speech. He was performing an execution. He was publicly accusing Jake of embezzling mill funds, of being mentally unstable, of being a dangerous saboteur who had tried to burn the facility down. Every word was a nail in the coffin of Jake's reputation. The town he had bled for was being told he was their enemy, and he was sitting in the dark, unable to say a word in his own defense. Despair was a cold weight, but beneath it, the old mechanic's mind began to work. He felt around the dark interior until his fingers caught on a metal plate. It was the hydraulic control panel for the trailer's heavy lift gate. He pulled his pocket knife, the one tool they'd missed, and began to work by touch. He didn't have much time. He found the pressure valves and began to short-circuit the internal wiring, ignoring the sharp electrical sparks that stung his fingers. He wasn't trying to fix the gate. He was trying to force a catastrophic mechanical failure in the reinforced steel locking mechanism. He needed an explosion of pressure, a violent release that the padlock couldn't hold. The pipes began to groan, a high-pitched whistle of escaping hydraulic fluid filling the small space. Jake backed away, shielding his face as the pressure built to a screaming crescendo. Then came the explosion, a deafening bang, as the locking pins sheared clean through. The heavy steel door didn't just open. It was blown off its hinges, flying outward into the dirt. A cloud of dust and metal shards filled the air, and Jake crawled out from his dark confinement, coughing and gasping, but free. He didn't stop to catch his breath. He had one more move to make. He sprinted toward the industrial parking zone where the heavy machinery was staged for the ceremonial log loading competition. He found the massive loader, a beast of yellow steel and hydraulic power. He climbed into the cabin, bypassed the ignition with a loose wire, and felt the engine roar to life beneath him. He ignored the sirens of the approaching security vehicles and focused entirely on the controls. He had spent 10,000 hours in cabins like this. The loader wasn't just a machine. It was an extension of his own body. He shoved the lever forward, the massive tires churning the mud as he headed toward the main stage. He drove the machine through the security perimeter, the guards scattering like leaves before a storm. He didn't stop until the loader's massive grill was inches from the stage, blocking the exits and trapping Cole and the mayor on the elevated platform. The crowd went silent, 1,000 eyes fixed on the man in the cabin. Jake didn't reach for a microphone. He reached for the loader's mechanical claw. He swung the arm over to a hidden crate he'd spotted earlier, a shipment of Apex soil testing kits he'd seen the surveyors using. He hoisted the crate onto the stage, the wood splintering under the claw's pressure. With a roar of the engine, he smashed the crate open, spilling the contents across the stage floor. Brightly colored chemical containers, marked with vivid orange, toxic, and biohazard labels, rolled to the feet of the horrified crowd and the local press. These weren't timber tools. They were environmental testing kits for heavy metal tolerance and groundwater contamination. The visual proof was undeniable, a splash of neon poison against the rustic backdrop of the festival. The silence of the crowd broke into a confused, low murmur that quickly escalated into a roar of realization. Jake jumped from the cabin and climbed onto the stage, his face streaked with grease and blood. He stood before Cole, his voice a thunderous interrogation that didn't need a microphone. "Tell them, Cole. Tell them why you're testing the North Slope for toxic tolerance. Tell them about the waste site. Tell them why our water's going to turn to lead while you're sitting in a boardroom in Seattle." He turned to the crowd, his arm outstretched. "They're not saving the mill. They're burying the town." The mayor stepped forward, his face a mask of practiced indignation. "This man is a criminal. He's a thief." But Jake was ready. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a handful of ledgers he'd snatched from the trailer during his escape. He threw them at the mayor's feet. "Then explain these. Explain why your signature is on the Apex kickback ledgers. Explain the offshore accounts." The mayor froze, his mouth working but no words coming out. The cameras were rolling, the town was watching, and the lie had finally run out of room to breathe. The tension broke like a dam. The townspeople, the men and women who had worked the line and walked the woods for generations, erupted into a riot. They didn't turn on each other. They turned on the stage. They surged past the Apex security team, their sheer numbers overwhelming the corporate mercenaries. Jake watched as the community reclaimed its power, the anger of 100 betrayals boiling over into a demand for accountability. The festival of celebration had become a court of reckoning, and for the first time in years, the people of Port Gamble were the ones holding the gavel. In the chaos, the local police, men who had grown up in the same woods as Jake, moved in to arrest the mayor and Cole Dawson. As they led Cole away in handcuffs, he stopped in front of Jake, his boyish charm finally stripped away to reveal the scared, desperate man beneath. "Jake, please." "I had no choice. They were going to take everything." He reached out a trembling hand, a plea for forgiveness from the only brother he had left. Jake looked at the hand, then at the man, and he saw the surveyor's flags and the red deficits and the shadow of his father's secret. He didn't take the hand. He simply turned away, his face hardened into a mask of cold, quiet resolve. The sun was setting behind the North Slope as Jake walked away from the ruined festival grounds. The noise of the riot was a fading echo, replaced by the ancient, steady rhythm of the forest. He walked until the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and old-growth pine. He found a fallen log, covered in a thick carpet of moss, and sat down. He was alone, his mill was a shell, and his oldest friend was a traitor. But as he looked up at the towering trees, their branches silhouetted against the darkening sky, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The sail was halted. The forest was standing. He was the solitary, weary protector of a broken legacy. But for the first time in his life, the land was finally safe. And in the silence of the pines, that was enough.